Chapter 19. I do not know when or by whom the word manipulation was first used in conjunction with what really are no more than common merchandising processes applied to the sale in bulk of securities on the stock exchange. Rigging the market to facilitate cheap purchases of a stock, which it is desired to accumulate, is also manipulation. But it is different. It may not be necessary to stoop to illegal practices, but it would be difficult to avoid doing what some would think illegitimate. How are you going to buy a big block of a stock in a bull market without putting up the price on yourself? That would be the problem. How can it be solved? It depends upon so many things that you can't give a general solution unless you say, possibly by means of very adroit manipulation. For instance, well, it would depend upon conditions. You can't give any closer answer than that. I am profoundly interested in all phases of my business, and of course I learn from the experience of others as well as from my own. But it is very difficult to learn how to manipulate stocks today from such yarns as are told of an afternoon in a broker's offices after the close. Most of the tricks, devices, and expedients of bygone days are obsolete and futile, or illegal and impractical. Stock exchange rules and conditions have changed. And the story, even the accurately detailed story of what Daniel Drew or Jacob Little or Jay Gould could do 50 or 75 years ago, is scarcely worth listening to. The manipulator today has no more need to consider what they did and how they did it than a cadet at West Point needs study archery as practiced by the ancients in order to increase his working knowledge of ballistics. On the other hand, there is profit in studying the human factors, the ease with which human beings believe, what it pleases them to believe, and how they allow themselves, indeed urge themselves, to be influenced by their cupidity or by the dollar cost of the average man's carelessness. Fear and hope remain the same. Therefore, the study of the psychology of speculators is as valuable as it ever was. Weapons change, but strategy remains strategy on the New York Stock Exchange as on the battlefield. I think the clearest summing up of the whole thing was expressed by Thomas W. Woodlock when he declared, "The principles of successful stock speculation are based on the supposition that people will continue in the future to make the mistakes that they have made in the past. In booms, which is when the public is in the market in the greatest numbers, there is never any need of subtlety. So there is no sense of wasting time discussing either manipulation or speculation during such times. It would be like trying to find the difference in raindrops that are falling synchronously on the same roof across the street. The sucker has always tried to get something for nothing, and the appeal in all booms is always frankly to the gambling instinct aroused by cupidity and spurred by the pervasive prosperity. People who look for easy money invariably pay for the privilege of proving conclusively that it cannot be found on this sordid earth. At first, when I listened to the accounts of old-time deals and devices, I used to think that people were more gullible in the 1860s and 70s than in the 1900s. But I was sure to read in the newspapers that very day or the next something about the latest Ponzi or the bust-up of some bucketing broker, and about the millions of sucker money gone to join the silent majority of vanished savings. When I first came to New York, there was a great fuss made about wash sales and matched orders, for all that such practices were forbidden by the stock exchange. At times, the washing was too crude to deceive anyone. The brokers had no hesitation in saying that the laundry was active whenever anybody tried to wash up some stock or other. And as I have said before, more than once they had what were frankly referred to as bucket shot drives, when a stock was offered down 2 or 3 points in a jiffy just to establish the decline on the tape and wipe out the myriad shoestring traders who were long of the stock in the bucket shops. As for matched orders, they were always used with some misgivings by reason of the difficulty of coordinating and synchronizing operations by brokers, all such business being against stock exchange rules. A few years ago, a famous operator canceled the selling, but not the buying part of his matched orders. And the result was that an innocent broker ran up the price 25 points or so in a few minutes, only to see it break with equal celerity as soon as his buying ceased. The original intention was to create an appearance of activity. Bad business, playing with such unreliable weapons. You see, you can't take your best brokers into your confidence. Not if you want them to remain members of the New York Stock Exchange. Then also, the taxes have made all practices involving fictitious transactions much more expensive than they used to be in the old times. The dictionary definition of manipulation includes corners. Now, a corner might be the result of manipulation, or it might be the result of competitive buying, as for instance, the Northern Pacific corner on May 9, 1901, which certainly was not manipulation. The Stutz corner was expensive to everybody concerned, both in money and in prestige. And it was not a deliberately engineered corner at that. As a matter of fact, very few of the great corners were profitable to the engineers of them. Both Commodore Vanderbilt's Harlem corners paid big, but the old chap deserved the millions he made out of a lot of short sports, crooked legislators, and aldermen who tried to double-cross it. On the other hand, J. Dowd lost in his northwestern corner. Deacon S.V. White made $1 million in his Lackawanna corner, but Jim Keene dropped $1 million in the Hannibal and St. Joe deal. The financial success of a corner, of course, depends upon the marketing of the accumulated holdings at higher than cost, and the short interest has to be of some magnitude for that to happen easily. I used to wonder why corners were so popular among the big operators of a half-century ago. They were men of ability and experience, wide awake and not prone to childlike trust in the philanthropy of their fellow traders. Yet they used to get stunned with an astonishing frequency. A wise old broker told me that all the big operators of the 60s and 70s had one ambition, and that was to work a corner. In many cases, this was the offspring of vanity, in others of the desire for revenge. At all events, to be pointed out as the man who had successfully cornered this or the other stock was in reality recognition of brains, boldness, and brutal. It gave the corners the right to be haughty. He accepted the plaudits of his fellows as fully earned. It was more than the prospective money profit that prompted the engineers of corners to do their damnedest. It was the vanity complex asserting itself among cold-blooded operators. Dog certainly ate dog in those days with relish and ease. I think I told you before that I've managed to escape being squeezed more than once, not because of the possession of a mysterious ticker sense, but because I can generally tell the moment the character of the buying in the stock makes it imprudent for me to be short of it. This I do by common sense tests, which must have been tried in the old times also. Old Daniel Drew used to squeeze the boys with some frequency and make them pay high prices for the eerie shears they had sold short to him. He was himself squeezed by Commodore Vanderbilt in Erie. And when old Drew begged for mercy, the Commodore grimly quoted the Great Bear's own deathless statistic. He that sells what isn't his'n must buy it back or go to prison. Wall Street remembers very little of an operator who, for more than a generation, was one of its titans. His chief claim to immortality seems to be the phrase, watering stock. Addison G. Jerome was the acknowledged king of the public board in the spring of 1863. His market tips, they tell me, were considered as good as cash in the bank. From all accounts, he was a great trader and made millions. He was liberal to the point of extravagance and had a great following in the street until Henry Peep, known as William the Silent, squeezed him out of all his millions in the old southern corner. Peep, by the way, was the brother-in-law of Governor Roswell P. Flower. In most of the old corners, the manipulation consisted chiefly of not letting the other man know that you were cornering the stock which he was variously invited to sell short. It therefore was aimed chiefly at fellow professionals, for the general public does not take kindly to the short side of the account. The reasons that prompted these wise professionals to put out short lines in such stocks were pretty much the same as prompts them to do the same thing today. Apart from the selling by faith-breaking politicians in the Harlem corner of the Commodore, I gather from the stories I've read that the professional traders sold the stock because it was too high. And the reason they thought it was too high was that it never before had sold so high. And that made it too high to buy. And if it was too high to buy, it was just right to sell. That sounds pretty modern, doesn't it? They were thinking of the price, and the Commodore was thinking of the value. And so, for years afterwards, old-timers tell me that people used to say, he went short of Harlem whenever they wished to describe abject poverty. Many years ago, I happened to be speaking to one of Jay Gould's old brokers. He assured me earnestly that Mr. Gould not only was the most unusual man, it was of him that old Daniel Drew shiveringly remarked, his touch is death, but that he was head and shoulders above all other manipulators past and present. He must have been a financial wizard indeed to have done what he did. There can be no question of that. Even at this distance, I can see that he had an amazing knack for adapting himself to new conditions. And that is valuable in a trader. He varied his methods of attack and defense without a pang because he was more concerned with the manipulation of properties than with stock speculation. He manipulated for investment rather than for a market turn. He early saw that the big money was in owning the railroads instead of rigging their securities on the floor of the stock exchange. He utilized the stock market, of course, but I suspect it was because that was the quickest and easiest way to quick and easy money, and he needed many millions, just as old Collis P. Huntington was always hard up, because he always needed 20 or 30 millions more than the bankers were willing to lend him. Vision without money means heartaches. With money, it means achievement, and that means power, and that means money, and that means achievement, and so on, over and over and over. Of course, manipulation was not confined to the great figures of those days. There were scores of minor manipulators. I remember a story an old broker told me about the manners and morals of the early 60s. He said, "The earliest recollection I have of Wall Street is of my first visit to the financial district. My father had some business to attend to there, and for some reason or other took me with him. We came down Broadway, and I remember turning off at Wall Street. He walked down Wall, and just as we came to Broad, or rather Nassau Street, to the corner where the Bankers Trust Company's building now stands, I saw a crowd following two men. The first was walking eastward, trying to look unconcerned. He was followed by the other, a red-faced man who was wildly waving his hat with one hand and shaking the other fist in the air. He was yelling to beat the band, 'Shylock, Shylock, what's the price of money? Shylock, Shylock!' I could see heads sticking out of windows. They didn't have skyscrapers in those days, but I was sure the second and third story rubbernecks would tumble out. My father asked what was the matter, and somebody answered something I didn't hear. I was too busy keeping a death clutch on my father's hand so that the jostling wouldn't separate us. The crowd was growing, as street crowds do, and I wasn't comfortable. Wild-eyed men came running down from Nassau Street and up from Broad, as well as east and west on Wall Street. After we finally got out of the jam, my father explained to me that the man who was shouting Shylock was so-and-so. I've forgotten the name. But he was the biggest operator in clique markets in the city and was understood to have made and lost more money than any other man in Wall Street, with the exception of Jacob Little. I remember Jacob Little's name because I thought it was a funny name for a man to have. The other man, the Shylock, was a notorious locker-up of money. His name has also gone from me. But I remember he was tall and thin and pale. In those days, the cliques used to lock up money by borrowing it, or rather by reducing the amount available to stock exchange borrowers. They would borrow it and get a certified check. They wouldn't actually take the money out and use it. Of course, that was rigging. It was a form of manipulation, I think. I agree with the old chap. It was a phase of manipulation that we don't have nowadays. I myself never spoke to any of the great stock manipulators that the street still talks about. I don't mean leaders, I mean manipulators. They were all before my time, although when I first came to New York, James R. Keene, greatest of them all, was in his prime. But I was a mere youngster then, exclusively concerned with duplicating, in a reputable broker's office, the success I had enjoyed in the bucket shops of my native city. And then, too, at the time, Keene was busy with the U.S. steel stocks, his manipulative masterpiece. I had no experience with manipulation, no real knowledge of it, or of its value or meaning. And for that matter, no great need of such knowledge. If I thought about it at all, I suppose I must have regarded it as a well-dressed form of thimble rigging, of which the lowbrow form was such tricks as had been tried on me in the bucket shops. Such talk as I since have heard on the subject has consisted in great part of surmises and suspicions, of guesses rather than intelligent analyses. More than one man who knew him well has told me that Keene was the boldest and most brilliant operator that ever worked in Wall Street. That is saying a great deal, for there have been some great traders. Their names are now all but forgotten, but nevertheless, they were kings in their day for a day. They were pulled up out of obscurity into the sunlight of financial fame by the ticker tape, and the little paper ribbon didn't prove strong enough to keep them suspended there long enough for them to become historical fixtures. At all events, Keene was by all odds the best manipulator of his day. And it was a long and exciting day. He capitalized his knowledge of the game, his experience as an operator, and his talents when he sold his services to the Havemeyer brothers, who wanted him to develop a market for the sugar stocks. He was broke at the time, or he would have continued to trade on his own hook. And he was some plunger. He was successful with sugar, made the shares trading favorites, and that made them easily vendable. After that, he was asked time and again to take charge of pools. I'm told that in these pool operations, he never asked or accepted a fee, but paid for his share like the other members of the pool. The market conduct of the stock, of course, was exclusively in his charge. Often there was talk of treachery on both sides. His feud with the Whitney Ryan clique arose from such accusations. It's not difficult for a manipulator to be misunderstood by his associates. They don't see his needs as he himself does. I know this from my own experience. It is a matter of regret that Keene did not leave an accurate record of his greatest exploit, the successful manipulation of the U.S. Steel shares in the spring of 1901. As I understand it, Keene never had an interview with J.P. Morgan about it. Morgan's firm dealt with or through Talbot J. Taylor and Company, at whose office Keene made his headquarters. Talbot Taylor was Keene's son-in-law. I'm assured that Keene's fee for his work consisted of the pleasure he derived from the work. That he made millions trading in the market he helped to put up that spring is well known. He told a friend of mine that in the course of a few weeks, he sold in the open market for the underwriters syndicate more than 750,000 shares. Not bad when you consider two things: that they were new and untried stocks of a corporation whose capitalization was greater than the entire debt of the United States at that time. And second, that men like D.G. Reed, W.B. Leeds, the Moore brothers, Henry Phipps, H.C. Frick, and the other steel magnates also sold hundreds of thousands of shares to the public at the same time in the same market that Keene helped to create. Of course, general conditions favored him. Not only actual business, but sentimental, and his unlimited financial backing made possible his success. What we had was not merely a big bull market, but a boom, and a state of mind not likely to be seen again. The undigested securities panic came later, when Steel Common, which Keene had marked up to 55 in 1901, sold at 10 in 1903, and at 8 7/8 in 1904. We can't analyze Keene's manipulative campaigns. His books are not available. The adequately detailed record is non-existent. For example, it will be interesting to see how he worked in amalgamated copper. H.R. Rogers and William Rockefeller had tried to dispose of their surplus stock in the market and had failed. Finally, they asked Keene to market their line, and he agreed. Bear in mind that H.H. Rogers was one of the ablest businessmen of his day in Wall Street, and that William Rockefeller was the boldest speculator of the entire Standard Oil coterie. They had practically unlimited resources and vast prestige, as well as years of experience in the stock market game. And yet they had to go to Keene. I mention this to show you that there are some tasks which it requires a specialist to perform. Here was a widely touted stock, sponsored by America's greatest capitalists, that could not be sold except at a great sacrifice of money and prestige. Rogers and Rockefeller were intelligent enough to decide that Keene alone might help them. Keene began to work at once. He had a bull market to work in, and sold 220,000 shares of Amalgamated at around par. After he disposed of the insiders line, the public kept on buying and the price went 10 points higher. Indeed, the insiders got bullish on the stock they had sold when they saw how eagerly the public was taking it. There was a story that Rogers actually advised Keene to go long of Amalgamated. It is scarcely credible that Rogers meant to unload on Keene. He was too shrewd a man not to know that Keene was no bleeding lamb. Keene worked as he always did, that is, doing his big selling on the way down after the big rise. Of course, his tactical moves were directed by his needs and by the minor currents that changed from day to day. In the stock market, as in warfare, it is well to keep in mind the difference between strategy and tactics. One of Keen's confidential men, he is the best fly fisherman I know, told me only the other day that during the amalgamated campaign, Keen would find himself almost out of stock one day, that is, out of the stock he had been forced to take in, marking up the price, and on the next day he would buy back thousands of shares. On the day after that, he would sell on balance. Then he would leave the market absolutely alone to see how it would take care of itself, and also to accustom it to do so. When it came to the actual marketing of the line, he did what I told you. He sold it on the way down. The trading public is always looking for a rally, and besides, there is the covering by the shorts. The man who was closest to Keen during that deal told me that after Keen sold the Rogers-Rockefeller line for something like $20 or $25 million in cash, Rogers sent him a check for $200,000. This reminds you of the millionaire's wife who gave the Metropolitan Opera House scrub woman 50-cent reward for finding the $100,000 pearl necklace. Keen sent the check back with a polite note saying he was not a stockbroker and that he was glad to have been of some service to them. They kept the check and wrote in that they would be glad to work with him again. Shortly after that, H.H. Rogers gave Keen the friendly tip to buy Amalgamated at around 1:30. A brilliant operator, James R. Keen. His private secretary told me that when the market was going his way, Mr. Keen was irascible. And those who knew him say his irascibility was expressed in sardonic phrases that lingered long in the memory of his hearers. But when he was losing, he was in the best of humor. A polished man of the world, agreeable, epigrammatic, interesting. He had in superlative degree the qualities of mind that are associated with successful speculators anywhere. But he did not argue with the tape as played. He was utterly fearless, but never reckless. He could and did turn in a twinkling if he found he was wrong. Since his day, there have been so many changes in stock exchange rules and so much more rigorous enforcement of old rules, so many new taxes on stock sales and profits and so on, that the game seems different. Devices that Keen could use with scale and profit can no longer be utilized. Also, we are assured the business morality of Wall Street is on a higher plane. Nevertheless, it is fair to say that in any period of our financial history, Keen would have been a great manipulator, because he was a great stock operator and knew the game of speculation from the ground tip. He achieved what he did because conditions at the time permitted him to do so. He would have been as successful in his undertakings in 1922 as he was in 1901. Or in 1876, when he first came to New York from California and made $9 million in 2 years. There are men whose gait is far quicker than the mob's. They are bound to lead no matter how much the mob changes. As a matter of fact, the change is by no means as radical as you'd imagine. The rewards are not so great, for it is no longer pioneer work, and therefore it is not pioneer's pay. But in certain respects, manipulation is easier than it was. In other ways, much harder than in Keen's day. There is no question that advertising is an art, and manipulation is the art of advertising through the medium of the tape. The tape should tell the story the manipulator wishes its readers to see. The truer the story, the more convincing it is bound to be. And the more convincing it is, the better the advertising is. A manipulator today, for instance, has not only to make a stock look strong, but also to make it be strong. Manipulation, therefore, must be based on sound trading principles. That is what made Keen such a marvelous manipulator. He was a consummate trader to begin with,